Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Just a heads up that I might not be able to do it next week. I got family coming in for the end of the year celebrations, and I might have to just skip a week and pick it back up right afterwards. But if there's enough questions and if there's enough time, I would definitely be able to do it. And if not, maybe I'll just do another fun live one to kick off the new year next time after that. But anyway, let's jump in and see what we got this week. First up, over on Patreon, Charles Madeira was considering getting a GameCube for his setup, which is mostly focused on RGB, and he would even really like to have 480p support, as well as possibly be able to use the Nintendo multi-out, since he already has an RGB SCART cable that he uses with a Super Famicom, as well as an RGB modded N64. And Charles read that a PAL GameCube might be a viable option, and because they will output RGB without any mods. However, PAL GameCubes completely stock out of the Nintendo multi-out port will only output up to 480i. So you get 240p and 480i. And if you were using something like a Sony PVM that only handled 15 kilohertz and could not do 480p, I would think that's a really good option. And you might even want to look into using Swiss to force certain games into 240p instead of 480i mode for that progressive scan look. But really, that is game dependent and just a weird suggestion. But the fact that you also want 480p definitely changes things. Charles mentioned the GC Dual, which should do everything that you need, except that's an internal mod. So you would need to do that full mod on the inside of your GameCube, and it should allow for RGB over the Nintendo multi-out. There might have been multiple versions of that. People might have forked the project. So please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And if I got this wrong, I'll reach out directly to you, Charles. But I'm pretty sure that's the mod that allows everything to be able to come out of it, as well as you could have an HDMI port installed where the digital out is, or you could cut a hole if you have a model that doesn't have it. But I do just want to mention there are plug-and-play adapters that would allow you to do this. In fact, as much as I'm not the biggest fan of the company, the Eon Mark II outputs both HDMI as well as analog video, and you could even use an RGB SCART cable. You just need to use the proper one to match with it. So I'll leave a link to the descriptions that you'll need for all of this stuff that have the links to everything in there. That would obviously not be able to let you use the existing Nintendo multi-out cable you have. You'd have to buy a new one, but you wouldn't have to install anything. So if you're the type of person that could handle kind of a complicated installation and doesn't mind modding a GameCube, then maybe just go right ahead with the GC Dual. But on the flip side, if you want to use it on multiple GameCubes, or if you just want to plug something in, it'll be much cheaper overall to buy the plug and play and a cable than it would to pay somebody to install the other mod. So that's completely up to you. I think there are other people who are trying to fork the project as well and try to do their own versions of getting RGB out of an NTSC GameCube with all resolutions supported, but I'm not sure if any of them are released yet or if they're just small quantities and you have to make your own or anything like that. The other thing that you could do, which I see that you posted out here, is you could mod existing GameCube component cables or D-terminal cables for RGB HV or RGBS, and that would work, but now you're taking expensive original cables and doing mods to them, and the board is very small. I did it myself, almost a decade ago, and I'm still not great at soldering, but I wasn't even close to good back then, and it wasn't easy at all, and I think it broke after a couple of months just because of a terrible soldering job. So you could absolutely mess with stuff like that, but I just don't think that that's the easiest way to go under any situation. If you told me you already owned a beat up Japanese D-terminal cable where the cable got ripped, or maybe you have component cables where, you only really had the console end as usable anyway, sure, by all means, make use of something that would have potentially been garbage anyway, but I wouldn't hack one up when there's other solutions available that are either plug and play or you could just install yourself. So hopefully I've pointed you in the right direction. Anybody, if I messed up the GC Dual thing, please correct me and I will jump on it immediately, but I think I'm remembering this correctly, and I'll try to leave all relevant links for you in the description. Next up, Rent Optional has a question involving static electricity. At this time of year in the Northeast, in their basement, which has carpeting, static electricity is bad. If they touch anything metal, they get the little shock. They've actually had their PS5 HDMI signal flicker with their TV when they plugged in a USB fight stick. They've had similar things happen when they plugged things into the Mister. It's just that little spark that everyone has experienced. They try to remember to discharge myself on a piece of metal that's on their TV stand, but they really don't want to accidentally blow out any of their consoles or other equipment. Do I have any advice at all on how to limit static electricity? It still happens even if they have sneakers on in their basement. They know it has to do with how dry the air is this time of year. Would a humidifier help? So, yes. Now, before I even start the answer, I just want to remind everybody, do all this stuff within reason. In the early 2000s, I worked in a computer room in a big company, and it was my first corporate job. And the computer room had a door that would open, and it was a glass door that when it shut, like made that like sealing sound. And the purpose of that was to always keep that room at within a certain humidity and temperature range, so the millions of dollars worth of servers in there would all not, or would have less chance of static electricity. And it still happened. There was still a couple of times you go, the screw down things in a rack server, the little metal screws that go into the rack, I would always touch that first. I don't know why I started doing that. It might have been because I saw a spark, or it might have just been because I'm fidgety and wanted to play with the screw. I don't know, but I used to always touch that first. And sometimes I would still see a spark even in a humidity and temperature controlled room. And this room even had things like if there was a fire, this special stuff would blow out that sucks all the oxygen out of the room. So we got caught in the room when that happened. We were supposed to like tuck in a ball and stuff like that. It was nuts. It was a different era, definitely. The alarm went off once for no reason, and it was a couple of seconds left before we got to the alarm because we realized I personally didn't have the code to disarm it. I was a kid. So luckily the senior VP was there, and my boss was rarely late that day. So yeah, I almost had that happen. But I told that story not just to ramble, but just to paint a picture of how crazy you could go and still have static electricity. So what I would do is just get one of those cheap little square meters that shows temperature and humidity, and just kind of go from there. And if you're seeing your humidity drop very low, like as soon as it gets around 20% anywhere in my house, that's when I start sparking all the time. Then I would just definitely use one of those. And the one, I watched a video from Technology Connections years ago on which humidifier to buy, because we've had just garbage ones forever. And this one seems to be doing a great job. I'll leave a link for it. I'll leave an affiliate link because whatever. I'll take the 4 cents I'll get off the sale if you decide to buy one. But it's the one that I got two, and I've been using those, and it works well. And you could set the humidity to automatically shut off at a certain point. So at night in the winter, I leave it all the way up because it'll never get past 40% in the wintertime with the heater on. But in a room like you're describing, you might want to leave it at like 35. It's really up to you, but that would certainly help. That would be something that's a pretty big deal. But the most important thing you could do is still discharge yourself all the time. So I would recommend getting a humidifier if you have expensive equipment and you want to take care of your stuff, just to make sure. And same thing, I guess, in the summer, if your basement gets really humid, you could look into a dehumidifier. And even if you just let it run at night, when you're not in there, because those things can get loud, that's fine too. But discharging yourself is definitely the most important thing. And I have the metal racks behind me. Those are just great because every time I go to touch anything, I just touch the rack first. And it doesn't really matter if it sparks or not because that just discharges everything right through it. And that's just by far the easiest. So it was a really long way of telling you just discharge yourself first and get a humidifier if you feel like it. But I just felt like some more description might, and especially that stupid story about my old job, would really help with perspective. Because even in a sealed room, you're still going to get it sometimes. And it absolutely will lower the life of your equipment, static electricity, and you could just straight up kill stuff. I've seen that before. So that is definitely a myth that I've heard over the years is, it's fine. I've grabbed this thing with static electricity a bunch of times and it's still running. But it's exactly like saying I've smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every day for 40 years and I'm still alive, so smoking doesn't cause cancer. Just because you got lucky doesn't mean that it's not true. So definitely be careful with static electricity, and I'll leave a link to the humidifier. And if people know of a better one, because it was a couple of years since the Technology Connections video, please let me know. Just a polite reminder, put the description, like brand, model number, and where to get it, but don't post the link because YouTube will auto-delete links. The support services will not, but YouTube will. So I'll leave that stuff in the description. Next up, Black Swan Retro was reading the article on Triad replacement PSUs that I wrote, and they're looking at Firebrand X's page also. They noticed he has recommended direct solutions. They're confused because when they look at the Rondo links below, they seem to have the PSU as well as adapters. They've bought the recommended solutions from Firebrand X for their PAL and NTSC-J SNES console. These worked out of the box and they didn't have any issues plugging them in. They thought the direct solution meant you didn't need any adapters, but looking at the Rondo links now, they're questioning. Do I know what the deal is and if they're okay without an adapter on their SNES console? Does direct solution mean what they think it does, and are these different from the Rondo triads that need the adapters? So you should be totally fine, but I will completely elaborate here for you. First of all, Firebrand X, and I think Steve from HD Retrovision and a few other people helped as well, determine the exact triads that you would need for plugging into these consoles. And sometimes you can get lucky and get one that plugs directly in, like with the Genesis one, or I believe Super Famicoms and a couple other things. And other times, like with a NTSC Super Nintendo, like an American SNES, that would require adapters even with those, because Triad just doesn't make that weird barrel connector that the American SNES uses. But on the flip side, when you have somebody like Rondo Castlemania trying to get these power supplies from the company, you have to remember that the more you order, the bigger the discount you get, which means the bigger discount you get. So Ryan could absolutely have taken the exact part numbers that FBX took the time to spell out and get those, but they would all be more expensive for you. And instead, he was able to determine, I believe also with the help of Steve from HD Retrovision and maybe FBX as well, I can't remember, but Ryan from Castlemania / Rondo was able to contact Triad and buy a ton of one PSU, then get pigtails for that in order to transfer the cost over to you. So it's okay if you don't like doing it that way. You could just reference FBX's page and then go to DigiKey or Mouser or one of those places. And then if you still need a pigtail, be able to get that manually. And that's totally fine if that's what you prefer, because you might want to get some of them that just don't need an adapter at all. But if you have a scenario in which you have a bunch of different consoles and you want to save money, you don't want to spend hundreds on power supplies, getting the adapters and stuff from Rondo would definitely be a better choice. And if you want one per console, what I just do is use non-conductive tape to tape the adapters on there. And that way, yes, the tape will eventually fall off, yada, yada, whatever. But it's more of a way of making it feel like a permanent solution so you don't mix them up. Or on the flip side, if you have something like your CRT with all the cables hanging out and you just want to plug your stuff in one at a time, then having one Triad and just using a bunch of adapters for each of your console would be a benefit to you. But it's a long way of saying what you're doing is probably perfect. Just double check the exact model number of the Triad that Firebrand X had listed. And if it matches the console that you're doing and if the barrel connector fits, then you're good. But for anybody else listening, if you just want to place an order, have a bunch of stuff show up, save a bit of money, you can go through those other links. So I will post a link to the My Triad page, which of course links to FBX's page anyway, if you want to reference that. But I think you're good to go. I just wanted to explain that and make it clear, both to put your mind at ease, but also for anybody else who's listening. I'm sure it's probably split. I'm sure some people would want to try to get the individual PSUs when possible, and other people are just like, no, I want to save a bunch of money, press one button, and have a bunch of it show up at my house. So it's totally up to you. Next up, Tim the Gamer said, several years ago, I remotely interviewed Kurt from Dotronix, which is the American-based CRT manufacturer. And with the pandemic being over, do I have any plans to visit the Dotronix headquarters? Maybe for a follow-up interview or a behind-the-scenes tour. I would love to, Tim. I absolutely would love to do something like that, but I have no plans to go anywhere. Life has gotten a little bit nuts, and I'm barely able to have time to get everything else done, but I would still love to be able to do stuff like that. I loved the RetroRGB road trips I did a couple years ago where I got to visit devs, at their houses and their labs, and it just kind of got to hang out with some really amazing people. And I wish I had the time and the budget to continue to do stuff like that. When I had that job that I loved, geez, almost 20 years ago now, I would travel. I mean, I used to have a packed backpack in my car at all times because I would randomly show up at work and the boss would be like, hey, is there any way you can get to North Carolina today, Taiwan tomorrow, whatever? And I loved it. I loved just seeing different places, especially because I was a little poor kid that never went anywhere as a kid. I think I went to Florida once and we drove to Massachusetts once to see an air show, and that was it. Like, we never went on vacations or anything. So being able to travel like that was always exciting, and I wish I could still do it. But no, zero plans to do any of that, at least in 2025, unless there's a huge change. I win the lottery or something like that. But I wish I could, and I would love to follow up with people like that. I'd love to follow up with Kurt and maybe even a couple of the other people I've talked to over the years that have awesome stuff like that. And I have made a bunch of friends who also do YouTube stuff. So maybe this is one of those things where we could do like a co-video where I could set somebody up who's a little more local who could drive over and just work with them to do a great video tour. But, I don't know. I'll look into all that stuff, but time is the thing I have the least of these days. And I wish I could do all of this stuff, but great suggestion. Next up is a couple questions from Cam. First, they're finishing their basement and plan on having a room with a permanent retro gaming setup. They'd like to run an in-wall SCART extension cable from one wall to another so they could have consoles on one wall and CRTs on another with no visible cables from the front. The cable itself will need to be around 20 feet long. So I have a suggestion here. So I'm assuming that you mean like consoles on the left wall, and then there's the angle, and the wall in front of you is all the CRTs. So that way the console cables are all still technically right there. They're just off to the side of you, and the CRTs are in front. And if that's the case, that should be pretty easy, and 20 feet is reasonable for analog video cables. But what I would suggest at that point is for you to break the signals out and use fully shielded cable for all of these. So if you're using all SCART, you could do something like a SCART to BNC breakout board. I believe Voltar posted an open source design for that. There's a bunch of them out there, but they're basically just PCBs with, SCART on the input, BNC and RCA on the output, and they're routed in a way where you don't get any signal interference. And then buy a bunch of long shielded BNC cables to run through your wall. You could actually do the same thing with HD RetroVision component video cables as well as their extension cable. And in fact, I would actually double up on that because their extension cables could be YPB, PR, left and right, or it could also be RGB, HV. So maybe just double up, because at this point, spending a couple of more dollars on a couple more HD RetroVision cables, you're out like $40, or maybe 60 if you have to end up getting 3 for the full total length. And that's totally fine if you think about all the work that you're doing to run the cables through the wall. If you're spending, even if it's $100, an extra $100 now, and you have all of these analog video signals just waiting there for you, awesome. But imagine if you get your room completely settled and then something changes in your setup a year or two from now and you would have to cut the wall open to change it. So now's the time to spend the money, because it's just going to translate to more options in the future, or backups, something ever happens, whatever. So a bunch of HD RetroVision cables and their extensions, or some really high quality shielded BNC cables should be all you need. And then just do the connector conversions on each side. And RCA or BNC to SCART boards should be basically freely available to make your own, or should be sold for a very reasonable price to allow you to do all of this. I believe Steve from HD RetroVision said that 3 in a row, so 1 set of cables and 2 extension cables, showed no interference that could be visible to the human eye and could only be measured on an oscilloscope. And that was 3 of those total. So it was 18 feet. And then you could still go further, and any interference added probably shouldn't be anything your eyes or ears could hear. But if you could fit it into the 18 feet, then that should be a great way to do it. So the other thing too is, how are you going to distribute the video? Is it going to be a bunch of CRTs? So you have, let's just say you have a G-SCART switch that you mentioned. So you have your consoles plugged into that, or the Arthremis switch that's coming out, the SVS, whatever. You have all your stuff plugged in, and then you have these signals run over to the CRTs. Are you then going to use like an Extron device to do the video distribution between multiple CRTs? Because here's where things get confusing. If you have like 3 CRTs, right? You have a 480p compatible PC CRT monitor. You have yourself like a PVM that's 15 kilohertz only, and then one giant consumer grade CRT, maybe a RGB modded or something like that. cool. Then you could just send all of the signals and only turn on whichever monitor you want. But do you want access to multiple monitors at the same time? And that's where stuff gets really tricky. Do you really want to be running these wires through the wall? That would be a lot more wires, and that would really complicate things. So, and in fact, if your basement was completely done or wasn't being worked on, I might even say, just have a spot for your consoles on your CRT wall and pick them up one at a time and move them over when you need to. But the fact that you're looking to refinish your basement and build this in is awesome, but you're going to want to think about how much total control that you're going to need, future expansion, and if it's even worth going super crazy, or if you really just want to have one signal to however many CRTs and they all just share the same signal. Extron devices would be really easy to do that with, or any kind of video distribution amp or something like that. So let me know. There's also a couple of people who have done similar things I could put you in touch with if you end up getting extra serious about this. But kind of let me know what you think. We could discuss it further in next week or the week after's Q&As and kind of just have the total, your total vision planned out, and then we can go from there. The other question is much easier. If you want to go from something like an extension cable to another device, do you have to worry about any kind of components on the sync line for SCART? And it doesn't matter how many extension cables you use. The answer is the same as if you were plugging in something directly. If you're going SCART to SCART, you don't need any components in the SCART cable whatsoever. If you're going from an Extron device or anything that puts out TTL level sync to a SCART device, you would need a resistor on the sync line. But for the RGB lines, you wouldn't need anything at all. Same thing with the audio. So that was an easy one at least. But think about the total setup. Let me know what your thoughts are, and we could kind of go from there. Now, moving over to Floatplane, JD213 was also wondering about AV Famicom audio balance restoring, specifically how to do it without an NES RGB installed, but they haven't found much. There was one thread on NestDev of someone asking a similar question in 2020, but it went unanswered. So I actually reached out to Firebrand X and Ace about this just because I didn't get a solid answer last week and I wasn't fully confident in what I had said. I had actually found an article that was a guest post on RetroRGB that helped explain a lot of this, and I reached out to FBX as well. So I'm going to leave some stuff in the description for you to, and whoever asked last week, sorry, I'm forgetting that person off the top of my head, but I'll give you some stuff to reference. I would read through the page and I would also check out Firebrand X's video and kind of go from there and see what's discussed, because that way you could figure out what's the best mod in order to get your Famicom or AV Famicom up to sounding the correct levels, if you will. I do think that someday we should have just a very clear basic write-up on the wiki, like here's what the problem is, here are the solutions if you even want to do them, et cetera, et cetera. But for now, I think I could at least point you all in the right direction. So links are in the description for both the article and the video, and we should probably take this a little further in the future. So if you don't get your answer, then let me know, and maybe we could just put a little bit more work into this now and kind of get the ball rolling. Well, that's it for this week. As always, if you have any questions whatsoever, please just ask wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. And as you saw today, I like just scrolling through and answering these in real time as if we were hanging out at a bar or a coffee shop or an expo together or something like that. So any questions you want, fire away. And of course, thank you to everybody who participates, and especially thank you to anybody who supports, because it really is you who's keeping everything going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you soon.